This video was deleted 3 times, and all 3 were deleted within the space of 24 hours. We know without doubt that the reason was because the untold story of this Saudi princess was meant to be kept out of the public, but somehow, God by His mercy allowed us to receive and share this experience. Don't skip this video because you may not come across it again after now, perhaps if it's being deleted. Now drop a word of prayer as you listen, according to what God is laying in your heart to pray for the victim. Also tell us where you are watching from so that we can connect and at the same time continue to include you in our prayers that are done every night by our prayer team. My name is Princess Amira, and what I'm about to share with you will sound impossible to many who hear it. But I assure you, every word happened exactly as I describe it. I was born into a world most people only see in movies or read about in glossy magazines. But I assure you, every word happened exactly as I describe it. I was born into a world most people only see in movies or read about in glossy magazines. My father served as a high-ranking advisor to the Saudi royal family, which meant our home was one of the grand palaces in Riyadh. From my earliest memories, I was surrounded by marble floors that sparkled like mirrors, fountains that danced with water imported from French springs, and rooms so vast you could hear your footsteps echo for seconds after you walked through them. Growing up as a Saudi princess meant living in a golden cage. I had 17 designer handbags before I turned 16. My closet contained hundreds of abayas made from the finest silk, decorated with crystals that cost more than most people earn in a year. Private tutors came to the palace to teach me languages, mathematics, and Islamic studies. I never attended a regular school. I never stood in line at a grocery store. I never even opened a door for myself because there was always a servant nearby to do it before my hand could reach the handle. But here's what nobody tells you about that kind of life. When you have everything, you start to realize that having everything means absolutely nothing if your soul feels empty. My religious training started when I was just 4 years old. An elderly woman named Fatima came to the palace every morning to teach me how to pray properly, how to wash before prayers, and how to recite verses from the Quran. She was kind but strict, and she made it clear that my eternal destiny depended on following every rule perfectly. By the time I was 10, I could recite entire chapters from memory. I fasted during Ramadan even when it made me dizzy and weak. I prayed 5 times daily without fail, positioning my prayer mat toward Mecca with absolute precision. Yet despite all this devotion, I felt nothing. Prayer felt like speaking into an empty room. The words left my mouth but seemed to disappear into silence. I kept thinking there must be something wrong with me. Everyone around me talked about feeling close to Allah, about experiencing peace through submission. But all I felt was fear. Fear of doing something wrong. Fear of bringing shame to my family. Fear of the punishments described in the Quran for those who failed to obey properly. The turning point in my life came in September 2020, during what should have been a routine family vacation. My father had taken us to our summer home in Dubai, a sprawling villa right on the beach. I was 27 years old at the time, and my parents were already pressuring me about marriage arrangements. They had identified 3 suitable men from important families, and I was expected to choose one before the end of the year. One afternoon, I was sitting on the private beach behind our villa, watching the waves and feeling absolutely trapped. That's when I noticed something unusual. A small waterproof bag had washed up on the shore, caught between some rocks. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to investigate. Inside the bag was a book. The cover was damaged from saltwater, but I could still make out the title. It was called More Than a Carpenter and the author's name was Josh McDowell. I had no idea what the book was about, but something told me to hide it under my abaya and take it back to my room. That night, after my family had gone to sleep, I began reading. The author talked about a man named Jesus who claimed to be God himself. He presented evidence about this Jesus, discussing his life, his death, and something called the resurrection. I had learned about Jesus in my Islamic studies. We were taught he was a prophet, nothing more. But this book challenged everything I had been told. What struck me most was how the author described Jesus's character. He told me about how Jesus treated women with dignity in a culture that often didn't. He showed me how Jesus touched lepers that everyone else avoided. He revealed to me how Jesus defended a woman caught in adultery when religious leaders wanted to stone her to death. This Jesus seemed so different from everything I knew about God. This wasn't a distant deity demanding perfect obedience. This was someone who pursued broken people with love. For 3 months, I kept that book hidden in a secret compartment in my closet. I read it over and over until the pages became soft from handling. Then I did something incredibly dangerous. I used my personal laptop to search for more information about Jesus online. I knew the internet was monitored, but I was careful. I used private browsing modes and search terms that wouldn't immediately raise red flags. That's how I discovered Christian websites and online churches. I found testimonies from other women in the Middle East who had become followers of Jesus. Their stories resonated with something deep in my soul. They talked about freedom, about being loved unconditionally, about having a personal relationship with God rather than just following rules. I had never heard anything like this in my entire life. One website offered a free online Bible, so I started reading the Gospel of John. The very first chapter told me something that made my heart race. It said that Jesus was the Word who was with God in the beginning, and the Word was God. It explained that Jesus became human and lived among us, full of grace and truth. Grace. That word stopped me cold. In Islam, everything was about earning God's favor through good deeds and perfect obedience. But this book talked about grace, which means undeserved favor. It revealed to me that Jesus offered forgiveness as a free gift, not something you had to work for or earn. The more I read, the more everything started to make sense. Jesus told his followers that he was the way, the truth, and the life. He said no one could come to the Father except through him. These were not the words of a mere prophet. Either Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be, or he was a liar and a madman. There was no middle ground. On December 23, 2020, something happened that I will never forget as long as I live. I was alone in my room in the middle of the night, reading the Gospel of Matthew on my laptop. I came to a section where Jesus was teaching his disciples how to pray. He showed them a prayer that started with the words, "Our Father in heaven." Those 2 words broke something inside me. Our Father. Not a distant judge. Not an angry master demanding submission. A father. Someone who loved his children. Someone who wanted relationship, not just religious performance. I closed my laptop and fell to my knees beside my bed. I didn't know how to pray to Jesus. I had spent my entire life reciting memorized prayers in Arabic. But something told me that Jesus didn't need fancy religious language. So I just spoke from my heart in plain words. I told him I didn't understand everything about Christianity. I told him I was scared. I told him I felt empty and lost despite having everything the world said should make me happy. Then I asked him the simplest question I could think of. If you're real, please show me. What happened next is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. A warmth spread through my chest that felt like coming home after being lost in the cold. Tears started streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, like I had been holding my breath underwater for 27 years and had finally broken through to the surface. For the first time in my entire life, I felt truly loved. Not because of my royal bloodline. Not because of my beauty or education or anything I had done. I felt loved simply because I existed, because I was God's daughter. That night changed everything. I started attending secret online church services streamed from other countries. I joined private Facebook groups for female believers in the Middle East. I connected with a woman named Sarah who lived in Lebanon. She became my mentor, answering my questions about faith and helping me understand the Bible. She told me about baptism and what it meant to publicly declare your faith in Jesus. But I knew that in Saudi Arabia, there was no such thing as a public declaration of Christian faith. Not for someone like me. For 8 months, I managed to keep my new faith hidden. I continued performing Islamic prayers when my family could see me, but my real prayers happened in secret, talking to Jesus like a friend. I wore my abaya in public, but underneath I wore a small cross necklace that Sarah had sent me hidden in a package of cosmetics. The discovery happened on a humid August evening in 2021. I had been corresponding with Sarah through an encrypted messaging app that I thought was completely private. We had been discussing my desire to be baptized, and she was helping me plan a secret trip to Lebanon where it could happen safely. What I didn't know was that my younger brother Khalid had been growing suspicious of my behavior. I had become distant from the family, spending more time alone in my room. I had stopped participating enthusiastically in family prayers. I had even questioned some things during a discussion about Islamic law, which was completely unlike my normally quiet, obedient personality. Khalid went through my laptop while I was sleeping. He found everything. The downloaded Bible files. The browser history showing Christian websites. The messages with Sarah. All of it. The next morning, I woke up to find my father standing in my bedroom doorway. His face was like stone. He told me to get dressed immediately and come to his private office. My mother was there too, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Khalid stood in the corner, looking both triumphant and scared. My father showed me printouts of my messages, screenshots of the websites I had visited. He asked me if it was true. He demanded to know if I had really rejected Islam for Christianity. I could have lied. I could have claimed it was just research, that I was simply curious about other religions. I could have said whatever they needed to hear to make this go away. But something inside me wouldn't let those lies come out. Instead, I looked my father directly in the eyes and told him the truth. I explained that I had found something real in Jesus. I revealed that for the first time in my life, I felt truly known and loved by God. The silence that followed was worse than any screaming could have been. My mother left the room sobbing. Khalid looked shocked that I had actually admitted it. My father sat down heavily in his chair and aged 10 years right before my eyes. He told me I had destroyed our family's honor. He said I had brought shame that could never be erased. Then he told me I had exactly 24 hours to recant everything and return to Islam, or he would be forced to report me to the religious authorities. I spent that day and night in my room, which had been locked from the outside. I wasn't allowed to have my phone or laptop. I was completely cut off from the outside world. Guards were posted outside my door to make sure I didn't try to escape. During those hours, I prayed more intensely than I ever had in my life. I asked Jesus if I was making the right choice. I asked him if it was worth losing my family, my home, my entire life as I knew it. Part of me wanted desperately to just give in, to pretend I had been confused, to go back to the comfortable lie of my old life. But every time I thought about denying Jesus, I felt a clear message in my spirit. He told me that he had not denied me when it cost him everything. He reminded me that he had gone to a cross for me when I was still his enemy. He showed me that real love sometimes requires real sacrifice. When the 24 hours ended and my father returned, I gave him my answer. I told him I could not and would not deny Jesus Christ. I said I understood the consequences, but my faith was not something I could compromise. The pain in his eyes was terrible to see. But his voice was hard as steel when he replied. He informed me that I was being sent to a secure facility for religious correction. He said I would stay there until I came to my senses. If I continued to refuse after 6 months, he would have no choice but to turn me over to the proper authorities for judgment. The facility was actually a compound in the desert, 3 hours from Riyadh. It housed women who had brought shame to their families through various means. There were women there who had tried to run away from arranged marriages, women accused of inappropriate relationships, and 3 other women who, like me, had converted to Christianity. The conditions were harsh compared to palace life, but not abusive. We lived in small rooms with basic furniture. We ate simple food. We were required to attend daily religious instruction classes taught by conservative imams who tried to convince us to return to Islam. We had no access to phones, internet, or any contact with the outside world. But here's what they didn't realize. By putting all the Christian converts in the same place, they had accidentally created a church. The other 3 women became my sisters in every way that mattered. There was Noor, who had been a nurse before her conversion. She had found Jesus after praying for a dying patient and witnessing what she described as a miraculous recovery. There was Layla, a university student who had been studying in America when she encountered Christians who lived their faith in ways that attracted her. And there was Hiba, a businesswoman who had discovered Jesus through dreams and visions. We found ways to encourage each other despite the constant pressure to renounce our faith. We memorized scripture together, reciting verses in whispers after lights out. We sang hymns so quietly that only we could hear them. We celebrated communion using torn pieces of bread from meals and water in small cups, remembering Jesus' sacrifice together in that unlikely place. The months passed slowly. Every week, religious leaders came to interrogate us individually, trying to find weaknesses they could exploit. They told me my mother was sick with grief over my apostasy. They showed me pictures of my father looking aged and broken. They described in detail what would happen to me if I continued on this path. The punishments. The public shame. The death that awaited apostates. But something strange was happening inside me during those months. Instead of my faith weakening under pressure, it was growing stronger. The more they tried to convince me that Jesus was just a prophet, the more clearly I could see the truth of who he really was. The scriptures I had memorized became more precious than any jewelry I had ever owned. The presence of Jesus in my prayers became more real than the marble walls surrounding me. After 6 months, my father came to visit me. He looked like he had been crying, which I had never seen before in my entire life. He begged me one final time to reconsider. He told me he loved me and didn't want to lose me. He promised that if I would just publicly renounce Christianity and return to Islam, everything could go back to normal. He would arrange a good marriage for me. I could have children. I could live a comfortable life. I took his hands and told him how much I loved him too. I explained that I wasn't rejecting him or our family or even our culture. I was simply following the truth that had set me free. I asked him to try to understand that I had found something worth more than comfort or safety. But I also told him clearly that I could not and would not deny Jesus Christ, even if it cost me everything. He left without saying another word, and I never saw him again. 2 weeks later, officials came to the facility and informed me that my case was being transferred to the religious court. They told me I would face formal charges of apostasy before a council of senior Islamic clerics. The 3 other Christian women received the same news. We were being moved to a proper prison to await trial. The prison was nothing like the facility we had been in. This was a real jail with concrete cells, iron bars, and the constant sound of women crying or praying or screaming. They separated the 4 of us, putting us in different sections so we couldn't encourage each other. I was alone in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, with a tiny window near the ceiling that let in a sliver of light during the day. The trial took place over 3 days in March 2022. I was brought before a council of 12 elderly imams, all men with long beards and severe expressions. They sat on an elevated platform while I stood below them, wearing prison clothes instead of my royal garments. There was no lawyer to defend me. In cases of apostasy, the evidence is straightforward, and there is no real defense allowed. They presented the evidence my brother had collected. The Christian websites I had visited. The messages with Sarah. The downloaded Bible files. They brought in witnesses who testified that I had been seen without my hijab on in the facility, that I had been heard singing Christian songs, that I had refused to pray the Islamic prayers properly. Then they asked me directly if I had renounced Islam and accepted Christianity. The entire courtroom fell silent, waiting for my answer. I could feel dozens of eyes boring into me. I knew this was my last chance to save myself. All I had to do was say no. Just one word, and I could live. But Jesus had told me he would give me the words to say when the time came. So I lifted my head, looked at those 12 men, and spoke clearly. I told them that I had indeed accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. I explained that I believed he was the Son of God who died for my sins and rose again. I said I could not deny this truth even if they killed me for it. The head imam's face turned red with anger. He declared me guilty of apostasy against Islam and sentenced me according to Sharia law. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. He announced that because I was from a prominent family and my apostasy had become publicly known, they wanted to make an example of me. Instead of a simple execution, I would be burned alive in a public square so that others would fear to follow my path. I felt my knees go weak. I had prepared myself mentally for death, but burning alive was a different kind of horror. The other women gasped. Even some of the court officials looked uncomfortable. But the sentence was final. He told me I would have 7 days to prepare myself, and then I would face my punishment. They took me back to my cell, and I collapsed on the floor. For hours, I couldn't pray or think or do anything except shake with terror. Burning alive. The agony would be unimaginable. How could I possibly face that? How could anyone face that? But slowly, as the shock wore off, I felt Jesus' presence surrounding me like a warm blanket. He reminded me of something I had read in the book of Daniel, about 3 men who were thrown into a fiery furnace for refusing to worship an idol. He showed me how he had walked with them in the flames, protecting them so that not even their clothes were singed. He whispered to my spirit that I would not face this fire alone. Over the next 7 days, I spent every moment in prayer and worship. I sang every hymn I could remember. I recited every Bible verse I had memorized. I wrote letters to my family on the few pieces of paper the guards allowed me, telling them I forgave them and loved them and hoped they would someday understand why I made this choice. News of my sentence spread internationally. Human rights organizations condemned it. Foreign governments issued statements calling for my release. Christian churches around the world held prayer vigils for the Saudi princess who was going to be burned alive for her faith. But nothing changed the court's decision. The execution was scheduled for March 28, 2022, at dawn in the public square. The night before my execution, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the pain that was coming. I kept imagining what it would feel like when the flames touched my skin. Part of me wanted to scream and beg for mercy. Part of me wanted to recant everything just to make it stop. But then Jesus came to me in what I can only describe as a vision. He showed me his own hands with the nail scars still visible. He reminded me that he understood suffering because he had suffered for me. He told me that whatever I faced tomorrow, he would be right there with me. He promised me that my pain would last only a moment, but my reward would last forever. When morning came, I felt a strange peace that made no natural sense. The guards came to get me just before dawn. They didn't chain me because I was too weak to run anyway. I had barely eaten in days, and my body felt like it was moving through water. They led me out of the prison and put me in a truck with covered windows. The drive to the execution site took about 20 minutes. When they opened the doors and pulled me out, I saw that we were in a large public square surrounded by thousands of people. News cameras were set up on platforms. Government officials sat in a special viewing area. And in the center of the square stood a tall wooden stake with piles of wood and dried brush stacked around its base. This was where I was going to die. The guards dragged me toward the stake because my legs had stopped working properly. My whole body was shaking now, and I couldn't control it. They tied my hands behind my back and bound me to the wooden pole with thick ropes around my waist and chest. The rough wood pressed against my spine, and I could smell the gasoline they had poured on the brush to make sure it would burn quickly. An imam approached and asked me one final time if I would renounce Christianity and return to Islam. His voice was almost kind, like he genuinely wanted to give me this last chance. I looked at him through my tears and told him I could not. I said Jesus Christ was my Lord, and I would die confessing his name. He stepped back and nodded to the executioner, a man holding a long torch that was already lit and burning. The executioner walked slowly toward the pile of brush, the torch held high so everyone could see. The crowd had gone completely silent, thousands of people holding their breath. As the torch moved closer to the gasoline-soaked wood, I closed my eyes and began to pray out loud. I told Jesus I loved him. I thanked him for saving me. I asked him to receive my spirit. My voice was shaking, and tears were streaming down my face, but I kept praying as loudly as I could. The executioner touched the torch to the brush. Flames immediately burst up with a whooshing sound as the gasoline ignited. The fire spread rapidly, circling the stake where I was tied. The heat hit me like a physical wall, and I could hear the wood crackling and popping. Smoke began to fill my lungs, and I started coughing. This was it. In seconds, the flames would reach my feet and I would begin to burn. But then something impossible happened. Just as the flames grew tall enough to touch my clothes, the sky above the square suddenly went dark. Not gradually, but instantly, like someone had switched off the sun. A massive windstorm appeared out of nowhere, with gusts so strong that people in the crowd were knocked off their feet. The wind hit the fire with such force that the flames were blown completely away from me, pushed to the sides as if an invisible shield surrounded the stake. rain began to fall. Not normal rain, but sheets of water so heavy you couldn't see 3 feet in front of you. Within seconds, the fire was completely extinguished, leaving only smoke and steam rising from the wet wood. The ropes binding me to the stake snapped as if cut by an invisible knife, and I fell forward onto the soaking ground. The crowd erupted in chaos. People were screaming, running in all directions, convinced they were witnessing either a miracle or the wrath of Allah. The guards who had been standing nearby were on their knees, covering their heads. Even the imam who had condemned me stood frozen in shock, staring at the place where fire had been seconds before. I lay on the wet ground, gasping and trembling, completely unburned. Not a single hair on my head had been singed. My clothes were soaked from the rain but showed no marks from the flames. It was exactly like the story of the 3 men in the fiery furnace. Jesus had walked into the fire with me and protected me from every flame. In the confusion and panic, no one noticed when a woman dressed in black ran from the crowd, grabbed my arm, and pulled me to my feet. She whispered urgently that we had to run now while everyone was distracted. Later, I would learn her name was Mariam, and she was part of an underground network of Christians who had been planning to help me escape somehow, though they never expected a miracle to give them their chance. Mariam led me through the panicking crowd to a small car parked several blocks away. Within minutes, we were driving away from the square while sirens wailed behind us. She took me to a safe house where other believers were waiting. They gave me dry clothes, food, water, and told me they had been praying for a miracle. They said God had answered in a way none of them had imagined possible. For 3 days, I stayed hidden in that safe house while Mariam and her network arranged forged documents and passage out of Saudi Arabia. News of what happened in the square spread like wildfire. Videos from people's phones showed the sudden storm, the extinguished fire, my unburned body. Some called it a miracle from Allah, proof I should not have been executed. Others called it witchcraft or a strange weather phenomenon. But the religious authorities were furious and humiliated. They issued a manhunt with a huge reward for anyone who could find me and bring me back to face justice. They claimed the execution had been interrupted by natural causes and must be completed. On the 4th day after my miraculous rescue, Mariam drove me to the border hidden in the back of a delivery truck. We crossed into Jordan with forged papers, and from there I was taken to a refugee center where I applied for asylum. The international attention my case had received meant several countries were willing to offer protection. Within 2 months, I was relocated to a safe country in Europe where I could practice my faith openly without fear. The underground church that rescued me helped me get established in my new life. I had no money, no possessions, no family. But I had Jesus, and I had my life, which by all rights I should have lost in those flames. Now, 3 years later, I work with an organization that helps Muslim women who want to learn about Jesus. I share my testimony with anyone who will listen. I've been baptized, joined a local church, and discovered a community of believers who have become my true family. Do I miss my old life sometimes? Of course I do. I miss my mother desperately. I miss the comfort and security of knowing where I belonged. I miss speaking Arabic every day and the foods of my homeland. Sometimes I cry myself to sleep thinking about everything I lost. But then I remember standing tied to that stake, watching flames come toward me, and feeling Jesus' presence so strongly that I wasn't alone even in that terrible moment. I remember the miracle of rain that extinguished fire and broke ropes that bound me. I remember that God loved me enough to split the sky open and save my life in front of thousands of witnesses. A princess gave up her crown, her palace, and her family. But a daughter of the King of Kings gained eternal life, true freedom, and a love that no fire could ever destroy. If I had to make the choice again, knowing everything I know now, I would choose Jesus every single time. Because no throne on earth compares to being called a child of God. No treasure compares to knowing you're loved unconditionally. And no comfort in this temporary life compares to the eternal joy waiting for those who remain faithful until the end. My name is Princess Amira, and this is how Jesus Christ saved me from the flames and gave me a new life that nothing in this world can take away.